Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, November 7th. It's Election Day. OMG. It's true. That's what time it is. Good morning, everybody. Go out and vote if you haven't voted already. I assume that if you're listening to the show, you have already taken care of all of that and either logged your vote early or you're listening to this on podcast because your first priority is to go out and cast that ballot. You got to do it. If there's any sort of election going on near you, and really, honestly, you should assume that there is one, just go to the polls today. And if there's nobody there and they're not voting, then log on and double check to make sure that you actually know your correct polling place. They may have moved things during this year. And then try again. And then if you're absolutely certain that there's just no voting going on, then fine. But there might be something going on that might have escaped your notice. At this point, any election is worth voting in. You don't want to be left without a voice. And, you know, this year, well, really, of all years, you can't ignore those local elections. If you don't know what's going on, you can log on and find out pretty quickly. Use that internet's, the big series of tubes that we have to bring you information, and get out there and cast your ballot. And if you've already done so, then kudos to you, and I don't know what, free slice of pizza? I don't really know what an appropriate reward would be. But how about living without Nazis on your school board? That would be helpful, right? I'm sure we're all up for that. Okay, so yeah, it's election day. This is the last day for voting. I guess that's really, this is the close of election season for this year, and probably, I guess, regarded as the official kickoff of the next election season. For elections taking place in November of 2024. Lots of people focused on that, but do your 2023 work before you start focusing too much on 2024. Lots to catch up on today. Don't know how much we'll get to. I didn't read yesterday the full text of the story of how who was reporting it. It might have been Washington Post with their idea of that yesterday's testimony in New York by Donald Trump himself in his New York Attorney General generated fraud case, a civil case, was likely to test his ability to, test his calm and patience and various other things that he doesn't actually attributes he does not have and has never exhibited. I remember that. What was the headline on that one? I probably have archived that at some point. Oh, you know what? That's right. It didn't show up in Pocket for some reason. But at any rate, this was all supposed to be a test of attributes that he had never exhibited. Well, it turned out to be true. Except that, he didn't even attempt to test any of these things. He just kind of went overboard. And what's happening here, I guess, is a manifestation of most of the legal experts and others observing the trial have essentially come to the conclusion that the Trump team has come to the conclusion that they cannot win this trial. And they really can't. First of all, it's a trial about the question of whether or not Trump is at heart. Him, the Trump organization, everyone around him, is involved in fraud or are personally just frauds, walking frauds themselves. And, well, you're going to lose that case, generally speaking. The only possibility of escaping would have perhaps been sneaking a couple people on the jury who are secret MAGA people and who would, provide enough votes to fail to find him liable under civil law, although, I don't know exactly what the rules are for a case like this in terms of the jury outcome. Of course, for most criminal trials, you'd be looking for a unanimous verdict. Not necessarily the case everywhere in civil trials, but of course they opted for, well, they really did, they ended up with, even if they don't think they opted for, a bench trial, which means that the judge, who's not particularly happy with Trump and the legal case that they're presenting and the way in which they're presenting it, not to mention their out-of-courtroom antics, really bothering the judge. And he's the finder of fact in this because it's a bench trial, and golly, that wasn't a very smart idea. But I don't think that they were very likely to win even with a jury trial, and I think they knew that. And they may have, in fact, looking back on this, they may have opted for the bench trial and then opted to make it look like it was some sort of either mistake or that someone was somehow plotting against them. But it may just be a play to try to convince the MAGA forces and anybody else who will listen for whatever reason that, he was only convicted because of the tremendous bias that the judge had against him, except they're having difficulty getting the judge to exhibit that bias. So the new part of this strategy is, let's antagonize the judge. Let's fight, let's scream, let's defy his orders, let's turn his courtroom into a circus. But isn't that dangerous? Won't he come down on you like a ton of bricks? Yeah, he probably will. But two things. One, for the public, you'll then say, see, he's biased against me. And for you personally, we'll be appealing whatever verdict there is anyway, and then we'll move that you can, that the judgment against you be stayed until, pending appeal. So, in all likelihood, you won't suffer any of the punishments until we're done with the appeals. And I don't know how long this goes. We may, of course, in the end lose an appeal, but we can delay this for a long time. Or we can go to trial on a fair basis, present the facts calmly and rationally, lose, and have no grounds for an appeal, but appeal anyway. We can go on and on, but you can get a lot of PR in the meantime out of antagonizing this judge. And, you should also feel free to, when you are under cross-examination and the New York Attorney General's office is seeking to nail you down and make you look like a grifter and a fraud, you don't answer their questions. Just speechify. And, if you want, just give your campaign stump speech over and over again. And they'll try to make you shut up and actually answer the questions. The judge will pound his gavel and yell a lot. But, don't listen. Just keep going. And, his options are to throw you in jail for contempt, to find against you at trial, etc. All these things are probably going to happen anyway, that he'll find against you at the trial. But if you get the contempt thing, then you say, I'm a political prisoner, the whole deal. Just complain the whole time that you're being targeted and pay no attention to the fact that you are, antagonizing the judge, that you're at fault here. Just keep going. And I guess that's what happened by by the reports I was reading via, let's see, which one? Blue Sky yesterday. Whose reporting was I reading so frequently? I don't know if I reposted it, however we term that in on Blue Sky. I know the word. It's just so dumb that I don't feel like saying it. Maybe eventually I'll come around on that. But I eventually adopted the parlance of tweeting. Right, I don't know. That didn't seem quite so crazy. Anyway, we were following along. Here it is. Joshua Friedman was doing great work keeping people more or less up to date on what was happening inside of the courtroom. No cameras allowed, of course, in the New York court for whatever reason. So people were dependent on Josh Friedman, and he was making it plain all day long that the strategy was, in fact, to antagonize the judge. So we had incidents like, again, Trump speechifying in his answers to the question, and the Attorney General at first saying, this is a yes or no question. But then later on, I guess the strategy changed a little bit too. The judge at some times moved on to the point where he was reminding the prosecutors, not the prosecutors, but, they are prosecutors. It's the Attorney General's office. It's not a prosecution of a crime, however. But at any rate, the plaintiffs in this case, the Attorney General's office, you can, cut him off and say, look, this is a yes or no question. Let's stick to directly answering the question. And at some point, the New York Attorney General's counsel there was saying, at this point, letting him ramble, it's all on the record now. So that could be useful to somebody. It may be useful to us later on. If he wants to ramble and accidentally confess to things, that's his business. But at some point when the judge got fed up, for instance, with Trump's rambling answers or attacks on him right there in the courtroom, for which there's supposed to be a gag order, but I guess the gag order applies to out-of-court statements. And but he was once again attacking the judge, attacking the staff, etc. And the judge says to Chris Kise, their lead counsel for Trump, you got to control your client. And Kise says, you're the one that controls the courtroom, not me. Don't look at me. Which, ordinarily would get you smashed over the head with the gavel. Not really what they do, but, the judge is like, wow, you're really antagonizing the judge. Ordinarily bad strategy. But again, they appear to be hoping to goad the judge into actually hitting somebody over the head with his gavel or something like that so that they can then move for a mistrial or appeal the verdict or whatever it is, or both. And since they're going to do it anyway, I guess wisely, it's very frustrating. But I think the judge has basically said, I think I can just suffer through this without imposing too much in the way of additional sanctions, without throwing Trump in jail for contempt for violating the gag orders. And I don't want to give him any ammunition to actually maybe possibly win on appeal. But I'll just sort of get through this ordeal and we'll sentence him as proper, or we'll find him liable and impose sanctions, etc., but without giving them additional substantive reason for appealing or moving for a mistrial. Not that they are going to wait for substantive and real reason. They're going to appeal regardless. If necessary, they'll appeal on an imaginary basis, or make something up entirely, or misconstrue something. So we can't prevent them from filing that. And at this point, they just want to file more paperwork so that they can insist on a stay of any sanctions that are imposed pending this appeal. They're just looking to waste time and burn hours, days, months, whatever they can in order to hang on to their money for a little bit longer. So it's got to be enormously frustrating for the judge, and it's enormously frustrating for the rest of us who are just like, throw him in jail already. This is a great opportunity to show that there are real consequences. There was an excellent argument put forward. I mean, when I say excellent, was it well formulated? Is it grounded in reality? Is it irrefutable? No, it just said, oh, that sounds like fun. Let's do that. That's sort of great argument. But I don't know if I have it immediately available. But somebody said this would be a great opportunity to demonstrate that he's not invulnerable, and heading into, now that we'll be done with this election season and heading into the next election season, the one in which he'll be running for president, a lot of his myth even with voters who, aren't totally convinced by him, or somewhere in the 6% who would jump ship allegedly if he were criminally convicted or something like that, to show them that he's not always going to be able to skate and have no consequences. That occasionally he will end up in jail, and even though he wouldn't be in jail on criminal charges at that point, a lot of the public won't parse it quite that closely. The fact that he was, widely reported in all the newspapers that he's spending the night in jail will make it seem like, well, Trump and jail, that's a thing that can actually happen, and that may change the dynamics of the race and of his other trials, et cetera, And I thought, it might be worth trying, but I think the judge is really looking to get this thing to a verdict without having to resort to anything like that, just so that there's minimal opportunity for there to be any basis, anything you can hang your hat on at all on appeal. So we'll wait and see. Now, let's see. I did put aside a couple of things where we'll get some explanation of what's going on and what is the strategy and how are they trying to make it work, and some other activities happening in courtrooms elsewhere. What's the what I had put aside at first was lawfare. Quinta Jurecic writing up for lawfare about, or writing on the Trump gag orders, and he's under at least two of them, right? In two different courts, one criminal and one civil. But I guess sort of just looking at the dynamics of this from a legal perspective. With the Trump gag orders, courts confront harassment. Okay. So what's happening here? The gag orders against Trump in New York and Washington, D.C., again, one civil and one criminal trial, respectively, reveal how the threat of violence is already shaping the cases against the former president. So slightly different tack here. Not so much about Trump and his own individual antics in the courtroom trying to antagonize the judge, and there are plenty, but rather this sly game, which is also being played on a different and a broader stage, I guess, by the person behind the Libs of TikTok account. What's her name again? Chaya Raichik, who was the subject of a front page USA Today article, which I did not put aside because I don't really want to publicize her work all that much, but it is an interesting parallel where there's this sly game going on where these two both think they're too clever for the law, and they may be too clever for being nailed down by the criminal justice system for whatever reason, in their game of pointing to targets with the understanding that the people who watch them do the pointing will then make terroristic threats against those targets. And perhaps even say, I read about it when I heard Donald Trump's comments or when I read Libs of TikTok, and both Trump and Libs of TikTok throw up their hands and say, I never told anybody to do any violence or to make any threats. I'm just pointing out what's happening in America today. And it just so happens that there's this implicit understanding with me and thousands of followers around the country that they should sacrifice themselves and their freedom to lodge terroristic threats against these people that I don't like and try and drive them from the public square that way. And yeah, you may go to jail, but I won't. And so that's awesome. It's an interesting parallel. But here, focusing just on Trump, the gag orders against Trump in New York and Washington, D.C. reveal how the threat of violence is already shaping the cases against the former president. That's something also that Marcy Wheeler spent a great deal of time, well, some amount of time on writing today, just saying, the media, of course, covering it like the circus that it is focusing on pointing out the antics that happened in court. And to some extent, I guess, saying it's so crazy, it just might work. But Marcy's complaint, without adding the context of, hey, by the way, a lot of the things he's saying actually concede a lot of the points that the New York AG is making and are actually helping build the case against him. But because he doesn't believe in the case against him, or that there should be a case against him, or that he does believe that he can get away with him regardless, I guess he just, I don't know. So he's doing what he's doing, thinking he's going to escape. And, that's an angle that the media ought to be covering too. Hey, actually, this helps make the case. We're paying attention to what the charges are, and he's confessing to, or a lot of this, or giving them ammunition to sentence him for these things. But it's the show that we're interested in covering, and that's kind of a pain in the ass too. All right, back to the lawfare article. This goes way back. Let's see. Through the late 1700s, how did we get here? English judges would sometimes enforce order within their courts by amputating the right hands of those found in contempt and displaying the severed appendages outside the courthouse. Now that is some rough justice. Wow, holy cow. Okay, through the late 1700s. Well, no wonder we wanted to declare our independence from England. Donald Trump probably doesn't even have to be worried about this particular form of discipline, and that's because it would be like removing a skin tag to chop his right hand off. But okay, he doesn't have to be worried about that particular form of discipline. But looking at the way things are going in the various civil and criminal trials against him, he may need to start thinking more carefully about what he's risking by continuing to push the boundaries of what the judges presiding over these cases will allow. In a New York civil case brought by that state's Attorney General, New York Supreme Court Justice, I guess they duo with Justice, Arthur Engoron, has already fined Trump $15,000, not a whopping sum, really, for a supposed billionaire, but this after the former president twice violated a gag order imposed by Engoron forbidding public comments about court staff. In Washington, D.C., Trump is in the process of appealing a separate gag order issued by Judge Tanya Chutkan that bars him from, quote, making any public statements or directing others to make any public statements, to supposedly to head off the libs of TikTok type problem. Well, okay. So barred from making any public statements or directing others to do so that target court staff or the witnesses and lawyers involved in the case. During a brief interlude in which the gag order was stayed, Trump let loose with a slew of posts on Truth Social, which nobody saw really, attacking, quote, deranged Jack Smith, complaining about dumb, weak, slow-moving, lethargic, gutless, and lazy Bill Barr, and questioning whether Mark Meadows might be willing to lie about the rigged and stolen, or he says, well, I guess it is stolen. I mean, the election wasn't, but what he's written here is stolen. 2 L's. So maybe referring to the baked goods here. Anyway, lie about the rigged and stolen 2020 presidential election to secure immunity from prosecution. Then, just hours after Chutkan lifted the administrative stay and reimposed the gag order on October 29th, Trump made another post declaring the order unthinkable and decrying Chutkan, who exempted herself, criticism of herself from her order, as very biased and Trump-hating, which, while not technically a violation of Chutkan's order, suggests that he hadn't exactly been humbled. With his civil trial ongoing and his various criminal prosecutions in the pretrial phase, Trump's confrontations with the 2 judges in New York and D.C. act as a preview of sorts for how he might handle the upcoming slate of trials. Clearly, he has no intention of backing down from his confrontational approach. Instead, he's situating himself adversarially against not just prosecutors, but against the justice system as a whole, including judges and court staff, tacitly and not so tacitly encouraging threats against them, then complaining bitterly of persecution when the courts respond. Even though, of course, he declares his philosophy to be, you come after me, I'm going to come back after you. Well, you come after the courts will come after you. Well, that's unfair, that's biased. That's not true, but that, whatever. His fans will cheer for that. As both Engoron and Chutkan have recognized, Trump's comments aren't just trash talking, they're potentially dangerous. I am very protective of my staff, Engoron said after issuing a second fine against Trump on October 25th for attacking his chief clerk in front of the press. I don't want anyone killed. Imposing her gag order, Judge Chutkan wrote, undisputed testimony cited by the government demonstrates that when defendant has publicly attacked individuals, including on matters related to this case, those individuals are consequently threatened and harassed. If Trump keeps pushing the boundaries established by judges, as it seems he will, this problem will only grow more severe in the coming months. Yes, probably true. Trump's habit of attacking the people and institutions seeking to hold him to account is nothing new. During the Russia investigation, he regularly railed on Twitter against Special Counsel Robert Mueller and his terrible gang of angry Democrats. Mueller's final report described in depth how Trump used tweets and public statements to alternately butter up friendly witnesses and then attack them viciously when news broke of their cooperation with investigators. Their legal analysis in the report is cagey, but Mueller hints strongly that such actions could well constitute obstruction of justice, wink wink, but only wink wink, an effort to block witnesses from speaking honestly with the special counsel by cajoling and threatening them. And whether or not the conduct rose to the level of obstruction of justice, the report's factual recitation strongly suggests that witnesses were, in fact, intimidated. In January of 2019, for instance, Michael Cohen canceled his planned congressional testimony, citing threats to his family. In a further echo of the Mueller era, one of Smith's filings points to gag orders issued by the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia in 3 Mueller-linked cases: the prosecutions of Trump associate Roger Stone, former campaign manager Paul Manafort, and accused Russian spy Maria Butina. The Stone gag order is perhaps particularly apropos. In that case, Judge Amy Berman Jackson barred Stone from making any public statements about his prosecution or the Mueller investigation, broadening the order after Stone attacked the judge on Instagram and posted a picture of her next to what looked like the crosshairs of a firearm. Wink, wink. According to recent comments by another judge on that same court, Senior Judge Paul Friedman, Judge Jackson required protection from the U.S. Marshals following Stone's post. With that in mind, Trump's Truth Social posts decrying deranged Jack Smith and true Trump hater, all caps, Chutkin, appear familiar. So too does the post that first inspired Justice Engoron's gag order. Trump baselessly claimed that Engoron's chief clerk, who he declared was, quote, running the case against him, was the girlfriend of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, as Smith's team put it in the office's initial motion for a gag order. Since the indictment in this case, the defendant has spread disparaging and inflammatory public posts on Truth Social on a near-daily basis regarding the citizens of the District of Columbia, the court, prosecutors, and prospective witnesses. All right, time for our first break. What else can we sneak in here? As Smith explains, those posts have resulted in multiple threats against Smith personally and intimidating communications directed against one of Smith's prosecutors, whom Trump targeted by name. We'll be right back with more explanation of this in our second segment. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Shall we continue with this rather long read? I think we will, just because this is likely to define what's going to be going on in court now and in the coming weeks and months as these other trials begin. And, well, we got to have some context for understanding what we see come out of this. And so, let's see, we left off by pointing out that Jack Smith has also complained about multiple threats against him personally and against his witnesses and prosecutors. Chutkin, too, has faced threats. As the special counsel's motion notes, a Texas woman was arrested in early August after leaving a voicemail with the judge's chambers that threatened Chutkin's life and referred to her with a racial slur. A number of news outlets have reported observing increased security around Chutkan at the D.C. federal courthouse, including federal marshals escorting her to and from the building's cafeteria. Smith links this pattern to the same conduct described in the January 6th indictment, pointing to Trump's habit of questioning the integrity of the 2020 election and singling out particular individuals for his supporters to harass as evidence of his, quote, established practice of issuing inflammatory public statements targeted at individuals or institutions that present an obstacle or challenge to him. Election workers and public officials who refused to play along with Trump's efforts to overturn the vote, or who, like Georgia's election volunteers Ruby Friedman and Shay Moss, became the subject of conspiracy theories amplified by Trump and faced harassment and threats. Moss and Freeman testified before the January 6th committee about unexpected visitors attempting to force themselves inside of a relative's home to conduct a, quote, citizen's arrest. This campaign of terror features prominently in Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis's indictment of Trump and 18 other defendants in relation to their efforts to meddle with the 2020 vote count in Georgia. Trump is generally canny enough to maintain some level of distance from this harassment. He hasn't, for example, explicitly directed his supporters to harass Judge Chutkan. Rather, he posts complaining about Chutkan, then disclaims any responsibility for whatever follows. The prosecution does not and cannot explain how President Trump's statements would provoke any reasonable listener to lawlessness, Trump's counsel huffed in a brief opposing the prosecution's proposed gag order. Chutkan, though, has seemed unimpressed by Trump's who, me posture. During the October 16th hearing on the proposed gag order, the judge compared Trump's post attacking Smith to King Henry II's famous complaint about Archbishop Thomas Becket, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" which led to Beckett's murder at the hands of overeager knights. If you call certain people thugs enough times, Chutkan asked Trump's counsel John Lauro, doesn't that suggest, Mr. Lauro, that someone should get them off the streets? Issuing her gag order. Oh, by the way, that's common sense law and order being tough on crime when Trump wants it done. But when it's done to him or his people, it's obviously a violation of their First Amendment rights to threaten you. Issuing her gag order on October 17th, Chutkan ruled that Trump's continued attacks pose a significant and immediate risk of intimidating witnesses with the threat of harassment and of harassing attorneys, public servants, and other court staff. She likewise voiced concern during the hearing about potential attacks on family members of prosecutors, pointing to Trump's past criticism of Smith's wife. Similarly, in Engoron's written order fining Trump $5,000 after Trump's first violation of the New York gag order, the justice warns, in the current overheated climate, incendiary untruths can, and in some cases already have, led to physical harm and worse. Key phrase in there, already have. Marcy Wheeler will be happy to see that. She keeps stressing in the coverage of this, you know, this is all on the record already. He's already done this. This isn't a future concern. And people really need to make note of that. Just today, in fact, I think she was making the same point with respect to the coverage we read some of yesterday about Trump's plans for revenge and retribution as the major theme. In fact, the very reason for running for office a second time, but as a major theme of his hoped for, in his mind anyway, second term. And pointing out again that, you know, not enough is being done to point out that this isn't a story about, well, golly, we think this is what will happen in a second term, but that rather it was all about what was happening in the first term as well. He has this as a track record. There's no speculation necessary. He's already guilty of having done this now. And that should be pointed out at every turn. We know this. The reason we're so sure this is a problem is he's already shown us that it is a problem right now and in the past, present, and future. He's been threatening people this way. All right, let's see. Moving along here and back to the story here. Oh yes, right. These are overheated in this overheated climate. Incendiary untruths can, and in some cases already have, led to physical harm and worse. As Engoron later made clear, This risk is not hypothetical. Since the commencement of this bench trial, he wrote, my chambers have been inundated with hundreds of harassing and threatening phone calls, voicemails, emails, letters, and packages. Only a day after Chutkan imposed her gag order, Trump announced his intention to appeal. Chutkan briefly stayed and then reinstated the order, which is now once again on hold under an order by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit while the appeals court considers Trump's appeal. He just blankets the place in paperwork and says, under normal circumstances with normal defendants, you very frequently will stay your orders pending appeal. So I demand the same treatment, even though he is not quite like any other defendant. And, I guess in that respect, you treat him like any other defendant. But everybody else has also pointed out, well, the antics in court, he really gets treated with kid gloves. Like, really, any other defendant, you're just in jail. You're just there. That's where it's going. But this is an ex-president, and of course, his counsel's argument. He's running for president again. He's the leading candidate. This would be an egregious violation of his First Amendment rights to speak out and be heard and to petition the government for redress of grievances and run as a candidate, and you can't do it. And judges are concerned about that, and they're letting him get away with it, in an effort to present as flawless a record to the appeals court that he's going to anyway as possible. So anyhow, all right, where were we here? Okay, so lots of stays, and now once again the gag order in D.C. on hold again while the D.C. Circuit Court takes up another stupid appeal. Despite Trump's complaints that the D.C. order has left him, quote, seriously restricted from campaigning in a free and open manner, the restrictions imposed by both Chutkan and Engoron leave a relatively broad window for what Trump can still say. Like, if he wanted to talk about how he's going to bring down inflation, explore energy alternatives in the future, or make America energy independent, or revive the manufacturing sector, or support our farmers, support the troops, I don't know, for that matter, support Israel, whatever it is that he would like to bring forward. There's like a million things you can talk about while running for president. This judge or that judge, and whether or not your former chief of staff or one of your lawyers from 100 years ago is a bad, terrible guy and we really need to get the FBI on him. That's just bad campaign material, honestly. You should be standing away from it. But he feels that he can't speak openly and freely if he's not attacking the judge's clerk. That's where his head is. As potential president of the United States, that's what he needs to talk to the American people about. That's problematic all by itself. Anyway, the ACLU, it says parenthetically here, also sought to file an amicus brief arguing that Chutkan's order was vague and overbroad. Thanks, guys. Particularly her use of the word target. Chutkan denied the organization's request to file, as she has with other outside filings in this case. Engoron's order, which he described as very limited, bars all parties from posting, emailing, or speaking publicly about any members of Engoron's staff, which opens the door to attacks on, say, Attorney General Letitia James and even Engoron himself. Chutkan's order, meanwhile, requires that all interested parties hold back from making public statements or directing others to make any public statements that target, 1, the special counsel prosecuting this case or his staff, 2, defense counsel or their staff, 3, any of this court staff or other supporting personnel, or 4, any reasonably foreseeable witness or the substance of their testimony. Interesting inclusion number 2 there. You're gagged from attacking your own lawyers. You actually have to do that from time to time with Trump. Here, Chutkan, like Engoron, has not prevented Trump from continuing to attack her personally. The order also explicitly allows Trump to continue criticizing the government generally, including the current administration or the Department of Justice, asserting the defendant is innocent of the charges against him or that his prosecution is politically motivated, and attacking platforms or policies of defendants' current political rivals, such as former Vice President Pence. Interesting, but now he's dropped out. But okay. Trump has already taken plenty of advantage of this expansive loophole while he appeals the order, complaining on Truth Social about Chutkan. How so? A radical left judge taking away my right to free speech. Engoron, a political hack who is doing the dirty work for the Democrat Party. And Biden, a crooked president engineering Trump's prosecution as election interference. But what might happen if Trump decides to push the limits of what he can say? Despite Trump's claims that Chutkan's order is unthinkable, both state and federal judges wield broad authority to impose discipline within their courtrooms through the use of the contempt power and have at their disposal a wide range of options for how to exercise that power, from fines to, at the more extreme end of the spectrum, incarceration. In his written order fining Trump $5,000 for the first violation of the gag order, Engoron warned that future violations will subject the violator to far more severe sanctions, including possibly imprisoning Trump under New York's civil contempt statute. The justice later expanded the gag order further after Trump's counsel, Chris Kise, harshly criticized Engoron's chief clerk for passing notes back and forth with the justice, continuing to tangle with the justice even once Engoron had recognized a continuing objection by Trump's team against his communications with his clerk, obviating Kise's claimed need to continue interrupting. That's interesting, right? So he's just using that as an excuse to disrupt the proceedings when it looks bad for Trump. And the judge just says, we'll just recognize that you continually object every time that we pass notes back and forth, even though there's really no problem with that, and nobody has ever successfully been able to object to something like that. We'll note for the record that you object so that you stop interrupting the proceedings. I don't know whether he did stop interrupting, but it's an interesting concession. The newly broadened gag order now covers attorneys' references to confidential communications between Engoron and his staff, and the justice warned of serious sanctions if Trump's team disobeyed. Chutkan, for her part, wrote in her ruling lifting the administrative stay on the order that before concluding that any statement violated the order, the court would afford the parties an opportunity to provide their positions on the statement's meaning and permissibility, meaning that if the D.C. Circuit allows the gag order to go into effect, any discipline for violating the order would not be a surprise. In fact, it would be only at the end of a lengthy, time-wasting process, which is, of course, a huge concession to the Trump team. Along with the contempt power, there's another route by which Trump could be held accountable for violations of the criminal cases against him. Following his indictment in D.C., he agreed to conditions of pretrial release that require him not to violate federal, state, or local law, which would include prohibitions against witness tampering. Okay. Last month, Smith's office also requested that Trump's conditions of release be modified either to directly require compliance with the gag order or to broaden the conditions existing prohibition on Trump's contacting witnesses to include indirect messages to witnesses made publicly on social media or in speeches. Parenthetically, it notes here, the judge in Roger Stone's case, the special counsel notes, took a similar approach in modifying Stone's condition of release. In fact, Trump's bond order in the Fulton County, Georgia case contains something roughly comparable, a requirement not only that Trump not violate any laws, but also that he perform no act to intimidate co-defendants or witnesses, including direct or indirect threats taking the form of posts on social media or reposts of posts made by another individual on social media. So they know his M.O. Chutkan denied that request by the special counsel to modify Trump's pretrial release conditions without prejudice, writing that granting it is not necessary to effectively enforce the order at this time. Without prejudice means you can bring it back up if things turn sour and it looks like it was warranted after all, and you want a second shot at it. So, if she were to take this approach, or if she were to find probable cause that Trump had violated prohibitions on obstruction, she could potentially revoke his conditions of release and order him jailed pre-trial. It's another way to get him behind bars. But I'm sure, she's looking to avoid that at all costs. At the moment, pretrial jailing seems unlikely, as does Engoron's threat of detention. There's a ways to go before either judge pulls out this most extreme of options, and Chutkan has already suggested a less dramatic approach, moving up Trump's trial date from where it's currently scheduled to begin in March 4th. Given that Trump's main legal strategy seems to be aimed at pushing back the date of trial as far as possible, that's a serious threat. Trump can be impulsive, but he's proven himself to be shrewd when it comes to positioning himself as a victim of institutions seeking to hold him to account. The pattern is familiar. Trump does something egregious, like, for instance, inviting Russia's assistance in the 2016 election, extorting Ukraine, working to overturn the 2020 vote. The other party responds with an investigation, impeachment, or prosecution, and Trump then complains of being viciously persecuted. Often aware of this dynamic, the institution in question seems to hang back from using its full power out of a concern over playing into Trump's hands, tiny that they are, and giving him fodder for his claims. That's what we were thinking maybe Judge Engoron was doing, and not bashing him over the head. The fear is that Trump will continue to escalate the situation, decreasing public faith in governing institutions by attacking them as politicized. I guess I would say also in the shadows there is the possibility of decreasing public faith in governing institutions by making them look like chumps on purpose and getting away with it. That's a problem too. But the threat of violence encouraged by Trump's complaints also contributes to the incentives for institutions to hold back. This is the dynamic in which the courts now find themselves trapped when it comes to gag orders against Trump, and with the additional layer that the subject of confrontation is itself Trump's propensity for encouraging harassment. That was an interesting point made at the end of the previous paragraph, and we kind of glided by it here, that the threat of violence encouraged by Trump's complaints also contributes to the incentives for institutions to hold back. Like, let's not punish him for these so severely for these gag order violations, because that will only increase the danger level for us. That's pretty amazing. So again, this is the dynamic in which the courts now find themselves trapped when it comes to gag orders for Trump, with the additional layer that the subject of confrontation is itself Trump's propensity for encouraging harassment. In this instance, though, the courts are arguably more equipped to push back against Trump than other institutions have been in the past. Consider Special Counsel Mueller, who has been criticized for soft-pedaling the evidence against Trump in his final report, but whose hands were tied by the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel's internal memos forbidding indictment of a sitting president. Yes, but remember, those are just internal memos, and although we love to honor that tradition, Trump is right now campaigning on the platform that he will do away with all such traditions so that he can directly control and politicize the Department of Justice. He's opening the door to simply saying, this memo about not prosecuting a sitting president doesn't count for this guy. Today, with Trump as it's not logical, it's just, look, self-preservation. Like Bush v. Gore, it should not be viewed as precedent. How's that? Does that patch the hole for you? Today, with Trump as a criminal defendant, the courts have the power to respond to his coded threats of and incitements to violence by imposing greater and greater fines, restricting his access to social media, or, yes, putting him behind bars. The question is whether they want to use those powers. Arguably, they're already allowing Trump far more leeway than they would any other defendant. That's where the complaints come in, like, no, actually, you should be treating him like any other defendant and putting him in jail. It's kid gloves that he's not already. But anyway, arguably the courts are already allowing Trump far more leeway than they would for any other defendant, perhaps out of concerns about potential reversals by higher courts or furthering a cycle of escalation that will only benefit Trump's story about his own victimhood. There's even a potential risk of providing Trump with the opportunity to egg on further violence. Imagine the vitriol that Judge Chutkan might face from angry Trump supporters if she were to order Trump confined pre-trial. In this sense, Chutkan and Engoron's decisions to exempt themselves from their respective gag orders may be noble, but they could also be potentially dangerous. Trump will surely keep pushing the limits of what is acceptable over the course of his several upcoming trials. In the meantime, though, his tactic of encouraging harassment has spread widely enough that he doesn't even need to be directly involved for fear to take hold. When Georgia released the names of the grand jurors who voted to indict Trump in Fulton County, as state law requires, the jurors immediately faced death threats and doxing from users of far-right pro-Trump internet forums. The FBI is reportedly investigating. In September, jurors hearing the case of January 6th defendant Brandon Fellows wrote a note to the judge expressing worry that Fellows, who had been representing himself, might have access to jurors' personal information, a concern that, Smith writes, demonstrates the need to protect potential jurors from fear of threats and harassment. Likewise, the federal judge overseeing E. Jean Carroll's second defamation case against Trump ruled on November 3rd that the jurors in the upcoming trial must be kept anonymous, pointing to Trump's recent violations of Engren's gag order. And Judge Friedman of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia recently ordered another January 6th defendant, Vitaly Gos-Jankowski, to be jailed before trial after Gos-Jankowski doxed FBI agents and prosecutors. Threats against public officials tend not to come from people in public life, Judge Friedman said, but from those figures' followers. Following the 2020 election, a flood of violent threats against election workers led to widespread resignations as people decided that their harassment simply wasn't worth it. Trump's attacks on state-level officials and volunteers, as Smith describes in the January 6th indictment, were the first wave of that flood, and now, with many cases against Trump underway, this crisis may be poised to hit the court system as well. The federal court, judges, and court staff can turn to the U.S. Marshals for protection, though a 2021 Justice Department Office of Inspector General report warned that the service has been stretched thin by a rise in threats against the judiciary. But state courts are typically even more strapped for resources, and it's not clear who jurors might be able to turn to if they face threats. In his motion for the D.C. Circuit to stay Chutkan's gag order and pending appeal, Trump declares that Smith and his team of prosecutors, along with the former government officials who might serve as witnesses, should be fair game for criticism, wink wink, on the grounds that they've chosen to enter into public life. Whatever the merits of that argument, it's not true of jurors who have no say whether to be there or not. Remember, they're forced to be there. They're summoned for jury duty. The difficulties of protecting jurors, along with witnesses and court staff, will only increase as Trump's trials move forward. How prepared are the courts to grapple with this challenge? And it appears, well, for one thing, I know we've gotten to the end of the article, but it appears they're not ready for that challenge. And once again, unfortunately, we'll be probably caught off guard on that, and that's not great. Okay, let's see. It's coming up on top of the hour break here. Let me turn to a couple other subjects and offer you this. This is an interesting perspective on that topic I don't love wading into, the crisis in Israel. But this is an interesting perspective on it that makes it a little bit more appropriate for our show. Will the United States be the next Israel? That's got to sound pretty bad to you, no matter what side you might be taking, or even the side of assiduously avoiding taking sides in all of this. War in the Middle East is a warning of what can happen when politicians put their own ends above national security. Remember what we've been hearing about most mainstream Israelis insisting on Netanyahu's removal from office or resignation from office and blaming him for the lapses in security practices that led to the October 7th attacks. And as a matter of fact, I did read this morning Netanyahu has finally, I guess, figured out a way to spin this around once more. He's now blaming all of the protests against his judiciary reforms. Remember the nationwide protest against his efforts to reshape the Israeli Supreme Court, which got up to and included protests by reserve military officers saying, hey, if you are going to undo the foundation of the rule of law in our democracy, or at least what's left of it, I'm not so certain I want to serve in the military that supports that regime unless this is undone. Apparently, Netanyahu, did not believe them and believed that in the event of a crisis, an attack on Israel, the military reserve officers would rally to the cause, which he equated with himself, of course, as prime minister, and thought that they would show up for duty. And in fact, for the most part, they have done that, despite their continued opposition to Netanyahu's reforms and his continuance in office. But just to make matters worse, Netanyahu has also said now, apparently, or alluded to the idea that, well, the reason Hamas thought we were ripe for attack was you and your protests. You thought you were protesting me, but this was viewed by Hamas as at face value, that you would refuse military service. So they figured, oh, well, now's the time to attack. Well, hundreds of thousands of them will refuse military service. So Netanyahu now blaming the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israeli opponents of his judicial reform proposals. I don't know how well that's going to go. But at any rate, this asks a different question from a different angle. And of course, I've given myself no time to actually get into it before the break. But I'm reading from Politico magazine. Daniel Dresner has put this piece together again. Will the U.S. be the next Israel? Americans are watching the Hamas attacks on Israel and the ensuing war with horror, mourning the death of innocent civilians, which are mounting. True. Thinking about their family and friends and worrying that the violence in Gaza will trigger an even more violent conflagration in the Middle East, the greater Middle East. All very well warranted. There's another reason, though, that Americans should be worried. What's happening in Israel now is a disturbing example of what can happen when elected officials use partisan and personal motivations to warp national security. And we've already had that problem, too. Like Marcy would remind us, this isn't a future worry. This is a current and past worry. The former president has stolen classified documents, taken them with him to Pervalago, showed them off to people, bragged, and who knows what else he might have done in furtherance of his assaults on the national security situation, up to and including blabbing about the abilities and technical range of U.S. nuclear forces on Navy submarines, right? So, but think about the similarities of what's going on in Israel and what's going on here. For years, Republicans in Congress have attempted to sabotage what they call the deep state. This includes placing holds on political nominees, castigating diplomats, officers, and analysts employed in the government as captives of big woke. And now we're beginning to see that language in Israel. Scary. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, I'm going to dive back into this Politico magazine piece from Dan Dresner, identified here in the italic type, in case you didn't know. And I certainly don't know these things offhand, although I recognize the name. Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, wherever that is, and a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Usually they throw that all into the title and tell you where that professorship exists, but yeah, do you need to know that so much as you need to know exactly what it is that he professes to be an expert in? Okay, I don't think so. But as I said, in the days immediately following the attack, I did see this, a lot of it coming from now suspended members of what was previously Netanyahu's cabinet, now replaced with a different group for the war cabinet, but in particular, those, and I can't bring everybody's name to mind, but and I'm not certain which one of them made the comment, but there were definitely indications that they wanted to adapt the Trump stance on these things. And as people were looking for explanations as to how security could have broken down so critically such that these attacks could be launched and executed, their answer was, well, it's woke activists who have infiltrated the deep state in Israel and have undermined security as in an effort to undermine the Netanyahu government or whatever else it is that they think they might be targeting. And it was pretty startling to see that anybody else in any other country would even bother to adapt these, I think, rather facially stupid arguments. But, American exceptionalism tells us that we're going to have some exceptionally stupid people. And, with 330 million to choose from, there's going to be a critical mass of idiots at any given time. But what about smaller populations that deal with national security threats on a more personal and visceral level all the time? Would they be subject to the same kind of stupidity and sticking their heads in the sand? And the answer is yes, and that's worrisome. So, as we left off, we mentioned for years, Republicans in Congress have attempted to sabotage what they call the deep state, because they think the deep state is sabotaging them, of course. This includes placing holds on political nominees, thinking about Tuberville's blockade, which continues, all in an effort to root out what they say is a government captive to big woke, which they don't know what it is, and that's a whole separate issue. But okay, they might see it as political theater, necessary to boosting profiles and fundraising, but as this week shows, there can be a price. This week was, of course, this was from October 12th, and they're thinking of October 7th and the attacks in Israel. Reporting suggests that the hardline elements of Benjamin Netanyahu's governing coalition were openly hostile to warnings from the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, and security agency Shin Bet, that settler violence would increase the security threat to Israel. Yes, and I guess I would draw a parallel here for those not, I don't know, I think probably everybody listening to the show is pretty well aware of what's happening there. But of course, Netanyahu's political support comes from that settler, those violent settlers, and that settler wing, which explains why, I think, why most of the armed forces were deployed facing or in the West Bank to protect settlers who would never let them go. They would attack their Palestinian neighbors both out of their own political and whatever else, criminal intent. That's their preference. They attacked Palestinians because they wanted to do that, but also the longer they prolong the violence and prolong the potential for violence at any time, going in either direction, the armed forces would be forced to stay there. Well, there's continuing violence here. You need to stay nearby. And if it ever calms down, it's in the settlers' interest to spark it again so that the IDF never gets the idea that they should demobilize from that area. So, that was important. That's important to Netanyahu's political support, but it also helps explain the imbalance of the forces and why they presented, they showed their backs to Hamas in Gaza. And okay. Where were we? Oh, yes. So hardline elements in Netanyahu's government are openly hostile to warnings from the IDF. Hey, this is dumb. We shouldn't be this imbalanced. We shouldn't turn our backs on Hamas. Even the security agency Shin Bet telling them that, and the fact that settler violence would increase the security threat to Israel. The more they provoke violence and perpetrate violence themselves, the more the Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, might be motivated to attack Israelis. This is a terrible idea. You should not be doing this. But of course, they viewed that as wokeism and deep state sabotage of their agenda, very much in line with the way you would expect a Trump administration to respond to warnings like that from the security agencies here. And they would simply, of course, say, there is no real threat. The reason you're trying to make us think there's a threat is because you're a deep state saboteur trying to get me to recommit my forces in a way that I don't want to do, either because my political support is in the West Bank or whatever the parallel would be here in the United States, or because you simply want to see me lose in some way. And so here we are. The next bit here in this paragraph, one Likud member of parliament, in fact, complained, the ideology of the left has reached the top echelons of the Shin Bet. The deep state, there it is, has infiltrated the leadership of the Shin Bet and the IDF. In other words, they're warnings to them, hey, we could be attacked by Hamas at any moment, or provoke larger scale attacks in the West Bank, but you guys keep forgetting about Gaza. Oh, yeah, well, you're only saying that because you're really deep state, as opposed to, no, we're actually listening to communications that indicate an attack is coming, which is our job. And you're undermining our work by claiming we're deep state infiltrators instead. And now we've suffered the consequences. Another Netanyahu coalition member stated, we see there is confusion as to who is an enemy. Hamas's surprise attack has highlighted further national security dysfunction within the Netanyahu government. There are confirmed reports that Egyptian intelligence directly warned Netanyahu that, quote, something fierce will happen from Gaza. Although that's always a pretty good warning. Allegedly, Netanyahu was indifferent to the warning, explaining that the IDF was swamped with terrorism threats in the West Bank, where his supporters are, you see. Israeli critics have stated that his coalition repeatedly ignored earlier warnings from Arab allies regarding rising levels of Palestinian frustration. Haaretz editorialized about a month ago, this week in this article, that a prime minister indicated in 3 corruption cases cannot look after state affairs, as national interests will necessarily be subordinate to extricating him from a possible conviction and jail time. Also sounds similar to what we have going on here, doesn't it? Israel is paying a steep price for its national security dysfunction right now in the form of hundreds dead, now thousands, a planned siege of Gaza with thousands dead in its own right as a result, I would add, and an imminent ground invasion involving hundreds of thousands of Israeli soldiers that may accomplish little more than producing more bloodshed and grievance. Here's my question. Dan Dresner poses, is Israel a harbinger for the United States? Back to our affairs, right? Are we getting a sneak preview of what will happen if Republicans succeed in their effort to exercise more control over the national security bureaucracy? And though most of you will only be facing elections on a local level, your first opportunity to fight this is today, although you may already have cast your ballot. Congratulations to you if that's the case. Next up, bashing political polarization is the first thing they teach you in... Oh, what am I looking at? This is an advertisement for another piece. Is that right? Bashing political polarization. This has nothing to do with anything else. It's an advertisement that the photo has been removed of, so I didn't recognize it as what it was. We got to skip over this block of text sitting right here in the middle of our Politico article. Okay, so where are we? The question, is Israel a harbinger for the United States? The problem comes when elected officials and political appointees decide that in order to achieve their desired ends, they need to reduce entire national security institutions to rubble. And by the way, yes, Trump is a uniquely difficult threat and takes things to a completely different level than anybody else, but Steve Bannon will say, well, that's my philosophy. Destroy the administrative state, yada, yada. This is not that far removed from some of the more destructive elements of the George W. Bush administration. And ironically enough, in many ways, Dick Cheney's penchant for stovepiping of information is the term we put on it before, but his insistence that essentially, without having the ability to resort to the now invented and now existing language for this, saying that the intelligence infrastructure, the intelligence agencies of that time, the early 2000s, were themselves had been infiltrated by Big Woke and the deep state and yada yada, and that the institutional actors there were purposefully getting in the way of his building the case against Iraq, the case against pretty much everybody everywhere in the Middle East and elsewhere for whatever reason. And we have lots of theories as to why that may be the case, but that every time they say, gee whiz, the intelligence doesn't support that, or at least there's no reason to believe that the raw intelligence should be interpreted that way, was undermining the American project as defined by Dick Cheney. And what was good for America was what was good for Dick Cheney, to add another reference from the last couple of days. And of course, it's all super ironic because it ended up being his daughter, Liz Cheney, who realized in some ways essentially the eventual danger of taking this to its logical conclusion and fought against it, such that she got herself ejected from public life and may never return. And if she ever did, it would be as the same hardline Republican operative that she was when she was making these comments, a temporary quote-unquote ally at best, but a valuable one. And the things that she was saying were helpful in establishing some boundaries. But remember that even within the boundaries that she would have us establish, she and other Republicans would make use of the same mechanisms, if necessary, to eliminate opponents to their agenda. So I guess we should not forget that. So where were we? Yes, the problem comes when elected officials and political appointees decide that in order to achieve their desired ends, they need to reduce entire national security institutions to rubble, like Dick Cheney wanted to do with most of the CIA. And let's be very clear, in 2023, all of the U.S. partisans engaging in such behavior are Republicans. And let's also be clear, that's pretty much who was engaging in that behavior in 2003 as well. Former presidential and likely future presidential nominee Donald Trump has set the tone here, if you ignore the last 20 years. The number of instances that the former president sabotaged U.S. national security while in office and afterwards is too long to recount in detail, though you really should. You should spend that time. There's the blabbing of secrets to Russian officials in the Oval Office, the tweeting of classified photos, all linked here, by the way, the refusal to return national security secrets once he left office, and the fact that he shared extremely sensitive information about the capabilities of U.S. nuclear submarines to Mar-a-Lago members, who in turn blabbed it to everyone else. His behavior was so egregious that multiple former cabinet members, most recently John Kelly, Trump's former White House chief of staff, have gone on the record to discuss the danger he poses, which has led us, by the way, as we read yesterday, to campaigning on the platform of punishing John Kelly for it, and prosecuting him personally at the direction of the White House. Back in June, his Attorney General William Barr warned on Face the Nation he will always put his own interests and gratifying his own ego ahead of everything else, including the country's interests. Of course, everybody believes in Israel that may be the case, or is the case with Netanyahu as well, but that's the gist of this article. But the gist of yesterday's article was, hey, another person that was specifically named as being a target of the Republican platform for 2024 is Bill Barr. What do you know? After losing the election in November of 2020, Trump fired or demanded the resignation of several political appointees on his foreign policy team because of a perceived lack of personal loyalty. He replaced them with acting officials, right? And who had minimal qualifications for their jobs beyond abject fealty to Trump. If he wins the 2024 election, Trump's stated policy positions will make his lame duck actions in 2020 seem tame by comparison. His campaign, in concert with the Heritage Foundation, has announced plans to convert tens of thousands of civil service employees into political appointees that the president could fire at his whim. According to the New York Times, if reelected, Trump plans to scour the intelligence agencies, the State Department, and the defense bureaucracies to remove officials he has vilified as, quote, the sick political class that hates our country. One Bush 43 official told The Atlantic, I can't overstate my level of concern about the damage this would do to the institution of the federal government. And this, I warn you again, it comes despite the fact that Bush 43 was also an enthusiastic purger of the intelligence ranks and, for that matter, the U.S. attorney's ranks as well. And ironically, it's just gone too far for Dick Cheney's daughter, Liz. I find that incredibly ironic. The CEO of the Partnership for Public Service explicitly analogized Trump's idea to Netanyahu's controversial and unpopular efforts to constrain the Israeli judiciary. And by the way, there was another point in all of this as I was reading through this that registered with me. Oh, yes, right. His campaign, in concert with the Heritage Foundation, rang a bell because we talked about the Heritage Foundation yesterday. But this is, remember, this is an article from October 12th. So this predates the article about the Project 2025 stuff that we read about yesterday by about a month. But remember, we did already have this tip and did know that the Heritage Foundation was involved in the other effort to invent what they call Schedule F, right? The reclassifying civil servants as political appointees so that he could, President Trump could fire them at will and purge the entirety of the bureaucracy and replace them with, ghost hunting idiots who will just do whatever he says. This story that we were worried about yesterday has been foreshadowed for us for a month or more. But really, as Marcy was saying, well, it was foreshadowed for us by 4 years of the Trump administration, not to mention the rhetoric of the 2016 campaign in which he promised to do this. This is now the better part of a decade that we've been on notice that Trump would do this, and the better part of a quarter century that we've been on notice that Republicans do this, that this is a Republican theory of governance, and that ridding ourselves of the Bush administration, finally, thank God, the Constitution pushed him out of office and gave someone else a chance. But, that someone else, in seeking out opinion from his own supporters, was also told point blank, this is the Republican theory of governance. The fact that you have had the opportunity, thanks to the Constitution's term limits, to replace the previous Republican administration is not going to undo this platform for Republicans. The next Republican administration is going to do exactly the same or worse, unless, and maybe despite, any efforts to draw the line and say this is unconstitutional and illegal, and will either see you removed from office or prosecuted for these transgressions after the fact. But, we did get health care, so that's kind of good too. Anywho, and that enabled the UAW strike, and okay, there were a lot of good consequences. There's good and bad with everything, just, so that we know the historical context of things and can repair problems perhaps in the future by learning from the lessons of the past. We restate them here. So, okay, now back to where we had jumped off, right? The CEO of the Partnership for Public Service explicitly analogized Trump's idea to Netanyahu's controversial and unpopular efforts to constrain the Israeli judiciary. Trump is the loudest, but hardly the only, Republican willing to sabotage the U.S. national security architecture. Other GOP presidential contenders have expressed an equally strident desire, and that's just this current crop. Vivek Ramaswamy is mentioned here, and he promised to, quote, use executive authority to shut down the deep state, whatever that even means. His plans included firing 75% of the federal workforce and dismantling the FBI and Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Why the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? Does he own a nuclear power plant? I don't know. Is he just cosplaying Montgomery Burns? I don't know. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been even more violent in his rhetoric, promising one New Hampshire crowd that all these deep state people, we're going to start slitting throats on day one. And that's why he's got the lifts in his boots, so he can reach their throats. The Gops caucus in the Senate has also been busy stymieing the foreign policy machine. The most obvious manifestation of this is Tuberville's hold on more than 300 military promotions and holding them hostage unless the Pentagon stops funding travel for servicewomen to receive abortions. This includes 2 selections for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, now pushed through, of course, as well as Middle East theater commanders for naval and ground forces. Though his Republican colleagues have expressed queasiness at Tuberville's tactics, they have remained unwilling to intervene. Tuberville recently made it clear that his position was unchanged despite the return of Middle East turmoil. While Tuberville might be the most obstructionist Republican senator, at the moment anyway, he is hardly alone. Marco Rubio has placed holds on multiple Biden nominees, as has Ted Cruz. The result is that at present the United States does not have confirmed ambassadors in Israel, Egypt, Lebanon, and Kuwait. Did we push through on Israel in the last couple of days? I can't recall specifically. There has been no confirmed USAID official for the Middle East for close to 3 years, nor has there been a confirmed State Department coordinator for counterterrorism for nearly 2 years. And don't we all think that's important? The Gops caucus in the House of Representatives makes its Senate counterpart look like a model of bipartisanship. As the majority party, House Republicans have taken the most concrete efforts to stymie the foreign policy and national security bureaucracies. Upon taking office, then Speaker Kevin McCarthy signed off on a new select subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government. Remember that? It's still around. That subcommittee has accomplished little beyond holding hearings aimed to fan the flames of dubious far-right conspiracy theories like the Twitter files. Jim Banks, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee's personnel panel, recently told evangelists, "Wokeism will eat our country inside out if we let it, and we've got to stop it from taking over and transforming the military." Sure, that's about to happen. In response, Peter Favor, is that how you pronounce it? A conservative expert on civil-military relations, noted, "We've reached the point where the concern is greater than the reality. No one has presented evidence that it is commensurate with the amount of energy that is being devoted to it." Meanwhile, Gops infighting in the House has already threatened to shut down the government once and forced McCarthy from the speakership immediately following his efforts to avoid that outcome. One of the sticking points for funding the government has been whether there would be supplemental aid for Ukraine to assist in its defense against Russia's invasion. Until a new speaker is chosen, we've done that now, the House cannot authorize any aid to Israel as well, though it could have if it wanted to. One of the leading candidates to replace McCarthy is the Trump-endorsed Jim Jordan. You remember what happened with that, but he is the House member most closely involved with Trump's efforts to incite violence on January 6th. He is also the current chair of that weaponization subcommittee. He's everywhere. Outside assessments of the Gops' ability to promote U.S. national security in the House have not been kind. One recent withering analysis noted, for the better part of a month, House Republicans argued amongst themselves over whether it was necessary or even desirable to keep the U.S. government open if they failed to use leverage they did not have over Democrats to secure spending cuts. It was a conversation divorced from political reality, and it produced only one concession from the party in power, cutting off support for a U.S. partner that has been ruthlessly invaded by an overt American enemy. Where was that lefty screed published? Well, that would have been a National Review. None of this is to imply that the U.S. foreign policy and national security apparatus is above reproach. Bureaucrats are far from perfect, and civilian control of the military is essential for democracy to work. It is the job of elected officials to ask hard questions. What Republicans are doing right now, however, bears little resemblance to proper political oversight. It more closely resembles the kind of intellectual jihads that Republicans claim to abhor in their enemies. It is conservative political correctness run amok. Some House Republicans have voiced concern that their current dysfunction factored into the timing of Hamas's surprise attack. It is highly unlikely, but it is encouraging to hear Republicans express concern that U.S. national security interests could be undermined by their own party's extremism, because it could be. Imagine, for example, what a second Trump term would actually look like. That was yesterday's exercise. If he only appoints toadies to cabinet-level positions, there would be no adults in the room. His planned jihad against the permanent bureaucracy would trigger an exodus of the best, most independent diplomats, general officers, and intelligence analysts. The ability of Trump's weakened administrative state to accurately assess or respond to any national security threat would be suspect at best and incompetent at worst. The likelihood of a successful terrorist attack on U.S. soil, undeterred Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, or open war on the Pacific Rim would rise exponentially. The U.S. military would be too busy bombing Mexico or governing U.S. cities to respond. As chaotic as Trump's first term was, his second term could set the world on fire. And here, I guess you could say, literally so. The failure of Israel to accurately assess the threat posed by Hamas is a cautionary tale of what happens when elected officials view their own government as part of a deep state instead of as professionals trying their best to provide useful intelligence and advice. If Republicans do well in the 2024 elections, Americans could view what is happening in Israel now as the same sneak preview that Brexit provided in 2016. Best way to fix 24? Fix today. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And just ringing in, and you likely heard it as we entered back in, Joan McCarter, as expected. So, hey, happy Election Day, Joan.
Happy Election Day. Not here.
Oh, well, it's not an Election Day or not happy? Both?
Not an Election Day.
Okay.
In Oregon.
You can be happy. Come on.
At least not in Portland.
Yeah, okay. Not even local stuff, huh? Okay, well, good. You're lucky. It's a big pain in the butt.
No, it's not.
Okay. Well, sometimes it is. I mean,
Oregon is mail-in ballot only.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, you have that, but you don't. So if it's all mail-in ballot, do they still not bother you on the phone all week, though?
No, they do not.
That's great, because they don't know when you're mailing things in. If I call, I could be interrupting them licking stamps.
You know, particularly here in Portland, it's not like we get really hugely controversial things.
Yeah.
You know.
All right, I see. Well, you're lucky there.
It's a liberal hellhole.
Right. Unlivable. You're right. Well, yeah, here, of course, one, we have big elections here in Virginia. And
yes, you have a big one today.
Yes, right. That's going on right now. And for the past, I would say, 16 years, I've been getting 1,000 flyers a day in the mail. But yeah, when my phone rings, it's, it does in fact approach the point. Now we just forget it. The landline rings. There's a machine on it for a reason. Barack Obama called. Michelle called. It's been real nice. They're very friendly, and they would like us to vote. And it's a good message and everything. But boy, yeah, it's. It's a good thing we have paper recycling here, because my mail is jammed with great stuff from friendly people who I, now no longer intend to, but did in fact vote for. Yes. So it's good to hear from them. And, the encouragement is, well, vote early and then we won't have to send these tons of paper to you. But, the message doesn't get to them really. And these postcards are dropped off a long time ago. They're coming regardless. So, okay. Anyway, election day.
Well, you're supposed to be taken. I mean, that's in a good GOTV operation.
It is.
They check the rolls all over the time and figure out who's gone so that they don't waste effort and material on people who've already voted.
The most important savings there is the door knockers. They get instantaneous information and they can skip your house. Your name just doesn't appear on their list.
Yeah.
That's great.
You should get fewer phone calls too.
Yeah.
But, there are so many various organizations doing GOTV now.
Right. And not all of them are as sophisticated. And the mailing operation in particular, I do have a little bit, unfortunately, I've gotten a little better understanding of mailing operations. And a lot of times those things are printed and put on pallets and sent to the post office, in September with instructions. And it's just coming either way. So anyway, the good news is you get to maybe have a say in not being ruled by Nazis if you go and vote. So you should do that. I think
that's a very good idea.
Yeah.
Do not be ruled by Nazis. Go vote.
That's
all the way down the ticket because, school boards in particular are important this time around.
It certainly is true that these places are, I guess that's the new development is these things are important in their own right. They used to be kind of sleepy backwaters, but they were important anyway because your local county government comes from people that got their foot in the door in the school board, and then they run for state legislature, and pretty soon they're Michelle Bachmann or Murdery Trader Green or worse, and they're in Congress, and gosh, there's just no getting rid of them like, nits or lice or something. And anyway, this is their stepping stone. Defeat them at home. Fight them over there so that we don't have to fight them over here.
Right.
I guess.
And
that's not really a great comparison, but
save your school board from the Nazis.
Mm-hmm. And save your kids, save the rest of us the trouble too. Otherwise, you end up 10 days from a government shutdown, let's say.
With Republicans in the House having no clue what they're doing.
Yeah, and I read that Republicans in the Senate saying, we're going to have to do all, 9 of our appropriations bills all at once. Not that
which, this is not a huge surprise. This is how it has to happen in the Senate because everything takes so long in the Senate. Right. And this is exactly what the House is going to be pissed about and why they're looking at this crazy laddered CR idea.
What's
Not
this?
that they want to use it to fund government because they don't want to fund government. At least the Freedom Caucus that's pushing the laddered CR doesn't really care about funding the government. They just want to create pain for the Senate.
Okay.
Because they don't want to have to be faced, and why, I don't know. They don't want a omnibus shoved down their throats.
They don't want anything in their throats.
Days before Christmas.
They say. Yes.
They don't want anything. They don't want government to be funded.
Well, that's definitely, that's certainly the case. And their whole thing was, we're not going to do these omnibus bills. We want them one at a time. But I guess if the Senate sends them to them as an omnibus, they'll feel wronged in some way. And I don't know whether they have enough votes to just reject that outright or they'll say, as long as we didn't do it, it's okay.
The Senate actually did, in committee, do these bills one at a time. For the first time in years. I can't remember how many, 12, I think? Or maybe I'm just getting 12 from the 12 appropriations bills. Anyway, each of them individually has made it through the Appropriations Committee. Right. They have all been passed.
So that's something. Maybe that'll be consolation to House Republicans in some way. Maybe not. Who knows? But that is an accomplishment. And even if they end up having to pass them on the floor altogether, and by the way, that, is partially courtesy of several threats of government shutdown, having to burn time, trying to do away with Tommy Tuberville's stupid blockade and various other time wasters. As we kept saying, all these things can be done, but they burn all that time. one of the things that ends up happening is even if you pass your appropriations bills individually in committee, you can't do it that way on the floor because there's just no time.
There is no time.
So,
which is something that House Republicans happily in their bubble, refuse to acknowledge or accept or understand.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's what they'll do.
But what it does mean is that on spending anyway, you've got a good, solid bipartisan basis for doing this. I mean, Republicans are bought into this. They don't want to shut down.
Okay. Well, that's good news.
So it's a united front, at least on government funding, against the House. But because Republicans can't make everything happy, they're picking a big fight over immigration.
Yes.
And creating the kind of racist stuff that the House had in its horrible immigration bill that they passed earlier in the year, particularly asylum, they call them reforms, making it nearly impossible for people to get asylum.
Well, that's some
it's a big immigration policy change they're trying to force, and Republicans, a handful of them, are insisting that, including Lindsey Graham, if they don't get these changes in the Ukraine-Israel border funding bill, they won't support Ukraine funding.
Oh.
And, of course, that funding bill, that supplemental request, needs, probably from the Senate standpoint, to be folded into the whole larger MAGA bus funding package, just, again, because of the time issue. Because they don't have time to do these things separately between now and November 17th.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess nothing is ever a surprise from... No betrayal is a surprise from Lindsey Graham. But, for a while he was sticking to his more traditional foreign policy stance and big advocate of funding Ukraine at all costs. But then I guess, has to keep a foot in the MAGA camp as well. And cheap points to be had in immigration. So doing away with asylum entirely, huh?
Not doing away with asylum entirely, but making it much more difficult.
Okay. Well, all right. Because that would be sort of, how do you even justify that? Like U.S. as the gated community on a hill. Nobody allowed in for any reason, no matter what's happening to you. Go back to where you came from, huddled masses. But it's
if you talk to Ryan Zinke about it, actually expel a chunk of them.
Of asylum seekers who have previously been admitted?
Palestinians in general.
Oh, wow. So you picked them out. Okay. You know what?
People of Palestinian origin living in the United States have to be rounded up and sent away.
He knows the Republican base.
And I believe 10 other Republicans. I think 10 Republicans co-sponsored that.
Wow. Well, that's ugly. But
you remember Ryan Zinke, the guy who was too much whacked up for the Trump administration?
Yeah, rode a horse to the office or something, which is by itself is not, that crazy. I don't know where you park, but the horse didn't like it, but he did far worse than that, and it was he was enjoying the free pass for corruption under the Trump administration, but was also just a little screwy, I guess, and they couldn't take it. So he decided to go back to Congress instead.
Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, Montana.
I'm sorry. So, so you mentioned a term that I'm not familiar with, the laddered CR. What's happening there?
Have you not been?
I have not. I haven't been. There's been catastrophes left and right in the household
So you
here.
haven't heard about the laddered CR?
No, I haven't. I've missed it entirely. So please.
This is the idea that the Freedom Caucus cooked up. Of course, coming
so
from
it sounds
Freedom
great
Caucus,
already.
Where you create tiers of funding. And last week when they were talking about it, it was sort of looking at every funding bill on as a different step on the ladder. Now they're looking at it as just two chunks. So a step ladder, a stool. It would set different it would be continuing resolutions that set different expiration dates for different funding bills. So right now they're looking at potentially 4 of them that they think are less controversial, expiring the beginning of December. And then the other 8 would expire in January, mid-January. When they originally gave this idea, it was a different expiration date for the funding for everything. So what you're dealing with would be sort of cascading shutdown threats. Potentially every 2 weeks, something else could be shutting down and probably would shut down because you would be paying attention to something else. It would be a great deal of uncertainty and constant turmoil, which,
a single
Freedom Caucus's idea, so that's,
Right.
This did happen once in the George W. Bush, or H.W. Bush administration. On the Israeli funding package, believe it or not.
That was back in the end of the era in which Republicans were opposed to financial support for Israel. Back in the old loan guarantees.
This was after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Israel had a huge influx of immigrants from Soviet Union, from Russia, from the former Soviet Union, who could finally get out. And they needed emergency assistance to just deal with this inflow of people for housing and everything else. And
this is interesting.
It was controversial.
Yeah.
So what they ended up doing was taking out the foreign ops part of the funding from an omnibus bill and handling it separately from everything else. So that was sort of the latter. Everything ended up being funded and there was no shutdown, but there was a bit of a threat with this specific chunk of money.
Yeah, okay.
So Roll Call has a big story about how they did that.
Oh, I would like to read that. All right.
So there is some precedent for picking a piece or one of the funding bills out of the mix and handling it differently. But what I think that the Freedom Caucus has in mind with this one is just, ongoing funding crises and shutdown threats.
Yeah. So that creates
also a way to piss off the Senate so that they don't end up being saddled with a omnibus bill just before Christmas.
Although it's interesting, as you were describing this, so we're talking about the laddered CR, it is one vehicle, one bill, but it has
one continuing resolution, but with fewer operations included, with just a few of the agencies included.
Okay, and then the idea that it could be that each of them or certain groups of them have different dates of expiration for their funding, but all contained in one bill, is actually an omnibus bill. No. It seems like to me. No? Oh, okay.
It's one continuing resolution with, say, 4 of the appropriations bills or 4 of the set chunks of agencies that are included in those appropriations bills. Yeah. So, say, Labor HHS would be in one.
One chunk, yeah.
Legislative operations would be one. Justice would be,
Okay. All in a CR.
All in a CR. Everything else would be in a different CR with a different expiration date.
Oh, okay. I thought they were going to throw together
multiple CRs with multiple expiration dates.
Okay.
So it's taking the 12 bills, doing them like a minibus, but setting different expiration dates for everything as a CR.
Yeah.
So a minibus CR, kind of.
I get you. Okay. Yeah, so it's still not one appropriation bill at a time. They recognize that they can't do this. Even in the House, they understand they have no time for that.
No, they're still trying to.
Oh. All right, so they don't understand it, and yet
that's what they're doing instead of putting a CR on the floor this week.
Okay.
We have until next Friday to...
Wow. All right. Yeah. Okay. That makes more sense then, because it was sort of a weird thing. Like, if you're going to move one CR with 5 different expiration dates for different departments built into it, that's just an omnibus. And I mean, although it's a CR, remember you said you weren't going to combine these bills. You are combining these bills. Any CR is kind of an omnibus, really, but it's just an abdication of responsibility to all of the departments all at once as an omnibus. Okay. Also,
it would be very, very confusing for the government, for the executive branch, to try to figure out, what's going to be funded till when.
Extra work, huge amounts of extra work just to figure out.
Yeah, and that's something that Republicans also refuse to acknowledge in their fights for shutting down the government. Even getting to the brink of shutting down the government is a huge burden.
Yeah.
For the executive branch. I mean, they have to take time out, and it costs money, lots of money, for all of these people to figure out, okay, this is how we're going to proceed if we have to shut down.
Yeah. That's,
it's taking people off of their regular job duties, is making them figure this crap out. It's a huge hassle.
Yeah. I see how it would be a problem. Now, a Trump administration would just not do it. Would just say, you say we're out of money, but we're not. Prove we're out. How do you know we're closed? I read the bill. Well, I don't think so. I mean, they could just go that way and say, just continue operating and let them sue us for operating without appropriations. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but make them find out. This was their idea. But I guess we just have too much, I don't know what, respect for the law and all this. All right. Well, that's not unique, because you've told us that there was precedent. And the precedent, by the way, also interestingly connected to today's problems, in that a lot of those people who were finally able to escape the then collapsing Soviet Union and move to Israel ended up as illegal settlers in the West Bank, which is fueling a lot of the tensions there and redirected the IDF's attention away from Gaza, and here we are. But they became, I guess, the Netanyahu base 20 years later. So, that's not so great either.
Not so great.
Okay. Well, all right. So it is November 7th. They don't have a great deal of time to do this. The shutdown trigger is the 17th. Thanksgiving is the following week. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, as you know, after Thanksgiving, it's immediately the month of Christmas. And so that's it. Wow. All right. Well, interesting tactic. Something new that's actually old, which creates an opportunity to learn a lesson of the past, or watch somebody not learn a lesson of the past.
Oh, yeah,
that's
yes.
Okay too.
But, the reason that they want to do this really is to piss off the Senate.
All right.
They want the Senate to refuse to do this and create more of a hassle. Chip Roy gave this quote to Politico. Let's force us to fight and get those done, those meaning the separate appropriations bills, and force the Senate to the table. That's the concept. Everything in this town is built around moving towards getting an omnibus bill all ready for Christmas. Part of breaking this town is trying to force the issue.
All right. I mean, I think I hear him saying he wants fight, break, etc.
Yeah.
But
fighting
also
and breaking
to get to an omnibus, which is weird because I
no,
thought they hate
to not have an omnibus.
All right. I can't even keep track of his
so that
comments.
All they're doing is negotiating individual appropriations bills. I mean, it's fine for Chip Roy to say this when the Senate has passed all of its appropriations bills through committee, and the House is trying to work on them, trying to force bills to the floor that haven't even been through committee yet, and trying to get them all done before the 17th.
Well, okay. I mean, trying to avoid an omnibus is and getting bills passed individually is a great thing to do in June. That's fabulous. Great idea. But it's November.
Get it done by August recess.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm so wrapped up in his comments about that his description of the way forward is fight, confrontation, force,
and break.
And break. I can't even concentrate on, is he for an omnibus or against an omnibus? Where is he on this? I don't understand what's going on.
He's very
Normally,
much against
all
of them are
I
against
thought
the
that's
omnibus.
what they said originally.
All of them hate the omnibus.
It's
and
just
why, I don't know. It does tend to have a lot of things crammed in.
Yeah, right.
Because that's the nature of
individually and
lawmaking. That's the nature of running a huge government.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it takes the Senate forever to get anything done, so they have to pile everything into one big bill because you've got Tommy Tuberville saying, we have to spend all of these hours doing something ridiculous.
Right. That just makes it worse. Even if they don't have that, the Senate, I don't usually think of it this way, but it is true. The Senate, whenever they're handed something by the House, 435 idiots going to put their heads together and, I'll say 200 idiots, and then the Democratic Party as well, who has an organization for this. And, they make mistakes too. But anyway, you got on the Republican side, 200, how many? 222 free agents all looking to raise money off of everything. And they're going to cobble something together and then hand it over to the Senate. There's only 100 of them to take this thing apart. And only 50 of them are interested in looking at what's in there. The other 50 are looking to make it worse. It's a big pile of work. So if you take, put 200 monkeys on a typewriter, on typewriters and ask them to craft a piece of legislation and then hand it to 50 other monkeys and say, now you type amendments to this thing. And somewhere the Democrats are supposed to digest all of this stuff and say, no, I guess maybe that's the reason. Republicans hate omnibuses because they know exactly what the dynamics are here, is that they have 200 wackadoodles trying to stuff a bill with garbage.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to decide.
And succeeding for the most part, except that's why they can't pass, say, the transportation appropriations bill right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's because ridiculously, and I don't know why, they're going after the most vulnerable of Republicans. They're making huge Amtrak cuts in the districts of California and New York people who are in Biden districts.
Okay.
They're taking out huge chunks of Amtrak funding. They're also, I don't know why they have to fight their own this way. They've also got a provision in the ag bill, because FDA is covered by the ag bill.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, to strip the FDA's authority to say the abortion pill can be sent through the mail. I mean, they're just doing, crazy, wacko things that they're larding these bills up with, making it harder for the moderates to win next time around.
Mm-hmm.
It's very bizarre what is happening in the House right now.
Right.
Kevin McCarthy, gave the power to the far right, to the hard right, to the Freedom Caucus to enforce these things. And that's what Mike Johnson is continuing with. Because he is one of them, really. I mean, he's not... Well,
that's true. He was happy enough. All right.
He's not really a Freedom Caucus member, though he has gone to their meetings, and they adore him.
Yeah. Well, he's there. By the way, guys, he's there to monitor your porn intake, so maybe you want to throw him out.
Wasn't that a fun story?
Nah, that was kind of gross. But yeah.
Kind of creepy.
That's definitely
really
the case. They are weirdos. But, I guess this would have been happening more or less the same way with McCarthy had they either opted to keep him, not try to force him more, or had Democrats cooperated in some way to keep him there. This was the plan. This was the reason he was the speaker, is that he had agreed to go this route. Swapping him for Mike Johnson is like a side note, I guess.
Yes.
Johnson was going to be helping the Freedom Caucus force this to happen as a backbencher. So,
there's even more jeopardy now, though. And I don't know, maybe it's equal jeopardy having such a weak speaker that is always, on threat of being booted, versus having one who has never done anything like this before and has no idea how to actually legislate. I mean, which is worse, having a total newbie in the job when there's really, really very complicated stuff that has to be done, versus having somebody who's fighting to save his job.
Yeah.
Every hour.
I don't know until it's...
I don't know which is worse.
Yeah. We won't know till it's too late. So, well, we'll find out.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's interesting. So this new speaker who you could run roughshod over him, but maybe because he's in a honeymoon period, if he has any opinions at all, he might get his way. We just don't know whether he has any. And then
I'm pretty sure he has them. I'm pretty sure they're aligned with the Freedom Caucus.
Oh, so
and I don't. And this is where inexperience comes in. Maybe he doesn't see the need to try to protect.
Yeah.
The vulnerable people, or
right.
Listen to people like Tom Cole, who is saying, this is a pretty whack job idea, this laddered CR. Do we really want to do that? I don't know that, because he's not been in leadership ever, because he's not really had to deal with committee chairs, whether he'll listen to him.
Yeah, I guess. He may just say, this is on autopilot. I don't really have to do this because I was on the side of the Freedom Caucus anyway. I'll just do it the way they wanted to. But of course, they have no idea either. They just want to do what sounds like it would be awesome to raise money off of. And there's nobody around. I'm kind of coming down
on the idea that a zealot newbie is worse than Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't be surprising to go from bad to worse.
Yeah.
In the Republican side of things. But
there's always worse.
Yeah.
There's always worse.
At least Kevin McCarthy never told us anything about, his family's porn consumption or that there even was a metric. I didn't know that was a measurable thing. I guess anything's measurable, but,
Oh, and what's really fun is that he's opened up all of his devices to whatever this monitoring software is.
Yeah, sounds like fun.
That's not dangerous.
Right. Russia, if you're listening.
Exactly.
I'm just saying that it wouldn't necessarily have to be the real data that you released. In fact, we'd probably circulate fake data a lot faster. I'm not saying I'm going to do it. I'm just saying somebody might. But, that's a bit of a danger. Okay. Well, we'll be back. Happy election day to everyone. If you haven't voted, what are you waiting for? And we'll see you in 3 days to the shutdown.
Yay!
Okay. Thanks, Joan. Take care.
Thank you.
All right, time now for us to turn things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy and the countdown to shutdown. Of course, let's see. Trump has incriminated himself, if you didn't know, and his children with one word on the stand, and he uttered many thousands of them. We'll let Justice sort it out for you and tell you which one was the worst. Next.